I myself, 2 weeks ago, had to go to a precinct to complain about a homeless person who was defecating and urinating. You chase them, and you chase them, and you chase them, and you chase them, and they either get the treatment that they need or you chase them out of the city.
Giuliani describing the homeless problem on his block and also how he handled the homeless when he was mayor. He's obviously not happy with Bill de Blasio or his administration's approach, and the feeling, as you might expect, is mutual. De Blasio's spokeswoman fired off this statement right after Giuliani spoke, quote, "Instead of getting rid of people, Mayor de Blasio wants to implement long-term solutions to homelessness, building new shelters, providing supportive services, and ensuring the mentally ill homeless receive the care they need." Michael, is this pure politics? Does Giuliani have a point?
So let's remember, de Blasio decisively won a contested Democratic primary and did not need a runoff. So he got over a threshold. But there were a lot of people who felt very strongly that Chris Quinn should have been mayor. There were people who felt strongly that Bill Thompson should have been mayor. And then there were folks around John Liu and Anthony Weiner's crowd that I really can't put my finger on.
Nor would
Don't
you want
go
to
there.
in that case,
So those folks that supported Quinn and Thompson are still around, and they still have important positions in the city, and they still have positions of influence. And de Blasio putting himself out there that all aspects of city government can be viewed and executed and implemented through the prism of reducing income inequality and lessening racial tension and making the city a more livable place and a more welcoming place, won the primary, but now you're leaving yourself vulnerable to attacks based on how you said you were going to govern, which is very different than the 12 Bloomberg years and the Giuliani years before that. More in common, as de Blasio's critics would insist, with the Dinkins administration and the initial chaotic years of the Koch time in New York City. So he put himself out there in a way that invited this criticism. Has he pivoted from campaigning in poetry to govern in prose in a way that is less ideologically driven? He hasn't done that. So is some of this unfair criticism? Yes. I think Giuliani's criticism is unfair. And I think that you couldn't find a starker contrast from the de Blasio mindset than you chase them, you chase them, you chase them. De Blasio City Hall isn't chasing anybody away. They're there to help people. So, you know, Giuliani's, I think, is a bit off point, but there is politics going on here that I think the mayor could be handling better. And
certainly, from a PR standpoint, the mayor has been left wanting to a certain degree. He could handle the press. He could handle PR questions a little bit better. Things about his image, things about...
Well, he didn't need to reply. He didn't need to respond to
right.
this. And I remember Nancy Pelosi was once asked a question about Michelle Bachmann, and she said, "What? Who cares? Next question." You don't have to engage all the time.
It's interesting because so much of de Blasio's campaign was focused on quality of life issues, particularly when it came to quality of life policing and other social services, making the city more receptive to those who are in the lower strata, those who are in need. But quality of life works a couple of different ways. I mean, people felt like the police were going too far in these quality of life crimes. Now that there's been a step back from that, there are all these complaints, well, the quality of life has decreased in the city. I'm not so sure that people tangibly feel like it has decreased in the city, but there's a part of me that wonders, you keep hearing quality of life, quality of life, quality of life. You start to notice things that maybe were there already.
Right, like when you buy a Ford, all you see are Fords on the street.
Right.
Or, you know, when you're expecting your first kid, all you notice are pregnant women, right? So, yes, but I would say objectively, you know, it is, to back into this, it is impossible if you are insisting that the police not engage in practices that they have been doing for the past 20 years, between 12 Bloomberg, 8 Giuliani, that there isn't going to be a change in the city streetscape and the cityscape. There has to be, and there has been. But whether or not you sort of shrug that off and say, well, you know, that's better than the confrontation and the feeling that the city was only for some and not all, well, that's the cost benefit. And that's something that the voters, in assessing whether or not to re-elect the mayor, are going to make that decision themselves.
And I assume that's where the whole Times Square topless painted women factor into. I mean, it's yet another block in the, or brick in the argument that he can't do anything about quality of life and that the city seems to be getting away from it.
Yes, and you have to wonder if all that coverage is a consequence of we want to continue to give him a hard time on these things. Or, you know, we were having a conversation on a panel, a larger panel, a couple of weeks ago here, where we talked about, you know, these are in many ways self-inflicted wounds that the mayor is instigating and bringing down on himself. And like when in tension with the governor, for example, the governor doesn't have to do anything because the city hall is going to step on a landmine and then the governor gets to sweep in
Right.
and say, well, look what they've done. So there are ways to not invite this criticism, but the idea that that tourists don't want to see topless women, the painted women, in Times Square, I don't think is fair. And again, he didn't need to respond to this. It's like, thank you very much for the input. There are 13 and 14-year-old boys all over the country that are going to be dining out on this for the next month. God bless.
If you could give one or two pieces of advice to Mayor de Blasio on how to, I guess from an image standpoint, or maybe just from whether he needs to respond to all of these pitches that are coming his way, what would you tell him? What would your suggestion to Mayor de Blasio be?
Not to be so responsive to criticism and to pick a theme and stay with it for a long time. We'll have a fight on Monday, we'll have the blowback on Tuesday. On Wednesday, they're talking about how it's a brand new day at City Hall because the mayor is doing, what's happened? It's been 72 hours. Fights are supposed to last longer than that. Everybody shouldn't be so thin-skinned, and he should take the criticism without responding and just move forward, find some favored media outlets and push it out that way. By favored media outlets, I don't mean just those that you get along with. You have to cultivate these things, and it takes a lot of work.
All right, let's move on to the opt-out movement that gained steam in New York last spring. 20% of primary school students refused to take state math and English tests in April. The teachers union supported the opt-out movement, saying the tests are poorly written and should not be used in teacher evaluations. Many parents said the tests are just too difficult and put too much pressure on their kids, but the Education Department is not buying it. Education Commissioner Mary Ellen Elia is now fighting back. She's meeting with superintendents and educating them on how to communicate how detrimental opting out is. She's also getting lawyers involved because, as it turns out, opting out is actually against the law. I'm curious, two approaches there from the Education Commissioner. Getting lawyers involved because it's against the law. What, is she going to charge parents with keeping her kids home? That seems like an overreaction.
There are so many important stakeholders in this. It's not just the parents and the children, the school children, but it's also the teachers and the teachers unions, both city and statewide, and then the school principals. And we had teachers and union officials, and in some cases, in Park Slope, for example, which is a certain demographic with a certain mindset, encouraging, we had these adults in positions of authority in these families and in these students' lives telling them not to take the test, which felt like it was a bridge too far. And I think that the numbers are, when it gets to the point where the numbers start skewing a statewide analysis to see if these are useful or not, I think the only people who are hurt ultimately are children who, as they progress, are going to need to be tested as they move along. So saying don't test and the testing is bad, I think, is delusional.
It seems like this is something of a negative approach to try to reverse the trend of opting out. I'm going to tell you how bad it is. I'm going to tell you how bad it is for the school. I'm going to tell you that you might get in trouble for doing it. Should there be a focus on the positives of it? Should they be trying to sell parents on the value of having the students actually take the tests?
Yes, but what happened is, no matter what you say in terms of the positive, let me backtrack. I think an apt analogy would be opting out of testing in your child's K through 12 educational career is vaguely equivalent to insisting that you don't need to get your child vaccinated, right? So there's this idea out there that you could choose not to do something. I don't know, maybe it's generational also, but if school was open, I went. It didn't matter if there was a mile of snow out there. If there was a test, you took it. I think that there's way too much involvement and there's too much focus. And if this is being used as a part of the way to assess teachers, and then teachers are encouraging students to opt out, we need to be talking about what that really is, which is more about labor management issues and union issues and city and state and being against the governor and being against SED, State Education Department, than really about any sort of educational pedagogy. I just don't buy it.
And there's so much about labor and about how you're going to evaluate teachers, but this notion of holding kids home because it's going to be so stressful for them, and I don't know where that comes from. I mean, that seems like a change in sort of the American psyche.
I think it's a generational shift. I think it's a consequence of helicopter parents, and I think you could draw a line from that to insisting on safe spaces on college campuses so that students don't feel intimidated by ideas that maybe they haven't been exposed to or agree with. I'm not a fan of any of this. I'm much more old school.
You got to settle down. We got to let everybody else on the panel talk tonight. We
Right.
want to get you at home. Speaking of getting involved, into this conversation on Facebook and Twitter. Sound off on tonight's question: do you think Mayor de Blasio has done enough to address the homeless problem? Up next, Republicans have no problem blasting President Obama or Hillary Clinton or any other Democrat on just about every issue, but what about the Pope? No, he's not a Democrat, but the GOP disagrees with the pontiff on global warming, income inequality, immigration, maybe now even Iran. How are they going to deal with that when the pontiff comes to the U.S. and speaks before Congress in just a few weeks? Stay with us.